See, I think that in criticizing God, and the Christian God in particular, you first have to articulate the Christian understanding of the situation and then criticize that. It seems to me you're creating, if you will, an atheist God and then knocking that God down. Here's what I mean by that. From the Christian point of view, we are pilgrims on this earth. Our life is short. Eternal life is the ultimate destination. And so suffering and earthly suffering is not the be-all and end-all. In a sense, if a child has cancer and God were to jump in and fix the cancer, that child would still die. So if you say that God's ultimate concern is not simply terrestrial death but salvation, then from that point of view, none of this has the quality of self-evident refutation that you think it has. The larger question becomes, what is the larger pattern of human destiny? And so from the Christian point of view, all you are doing is saying that because there's earthly suffering, when earthly suffering is not the final picture, nevertheless that convinces you, but only within a pre-existing atheist framework, that there is no God.
Can I respond, or is it your turn for a question? I don't want to jump in if...
Oh, well, let me take my turn and then you'll have yours.
Okay, all right.
I want to come back a little bit to Gates and Buffett and the Carnegies and so on. First of all, Carnegie, as you know, wrote very explicitly on Christianity. His book, The Gospel of Wealth, for example, talks specifically about stewardship, Christian responsibility. But even Gates and Buffett, are you denying that these men are a product of a Christian civilization, Christian education? Are you denying that the assumptions of Athens and Jerusalem are imbued in our culture so that even secular people would be exposed to them? Are you denying that in some senses modern philanthropy, which by the way is a real peculiarity of Western civilization, in many other cultures people accumulate enormous wealth and don't feel any obligation to give any of it away, let alone most of it away. So this impulse, I think, historically, philosophically, can't be understood divorced from its religious foundations, can it?
Look, of course it's true that Buffett and Gates are the products of a Western civilization which has been dominated for the last 2,000 years by Christianity. You actually said, interestingly, Athens and Rome, and of course I think it's true that the influence of Athens, ancient Greece, has been important. And for Aristotle, magnanimity was a virtue. That is, and that includes, giving things away, being generous, is part of that. Not exactly Christian compassion. I would agree with you with that. It's a different conception. But it's nevertheless significant, I think, that these people, both of whom have said publicly that they don't really have a lot of time for religion, they're really not interested in it, have been the ones who have undoubtedly given most of the wealth. So I think it's clear that, though Christianity may have been a good influence in various ways, I'm not denying that, and some things of it are noble and should be picked up and preserved. It's clearly not necessary to be a believer to be among the greatest philanthropists of our time. If I can now come back to what you were saying about suffering, you said it's not the be-all and end-all, that's salvation. We only live here for a short time. Look, even if I were to accept that, I would still think it was a bad thing that there is this unnecessary suffering in the world, in these children dying painfully unnecessary, and most of us do believe that because, of course, we do our best to stop it. So that suggests that we also think the world would be better without it. Yet, it's still there. But even if I were to give you that and say, okay, it doesn't matter for beings who have eternal salvation, you kept talking about humans. You have still not addressed the point that animals suffer too in this world. And I don't think you believe, or Christians believe, that they have an eternal life and have the prospect of salvation. So you still haven't explained why animals suffer in this world.
Well, earlier you chided me, but the point I was trying to make is that animals are primarily responsible for the suffering of other animals, aren't they?
No.
In other words, no. You wouldn't say that, haven't you watched the Nature Channel?
Yeah, it's interesting that the Nature Channel does not go somewhere where there's a drought, parts of southeastern Australia at the moment, where I come from, for example, and have long lingering shots of kangaroos who are dying of thirst because the creeks have dried up. Doesn't make good television.
Well, look.
Happens, though.
You're talking about things being right and wrong, good and evil, and the point I was suggesting earlier is these concepts have no meaning in a Darwinian universe. This is the point I was getting at. The idea of objective good and objective evil presumes the existence of external morality, a standard by which you can confidently say, in the belief that all these people will agree with you, that there is such a thing as right and wrong. So even suffering, for all its mystery, seems to me in a certain way to be pointing to this unwavering standard, which is in a sense the product of God. In other words, the idea of an objective morality by which we judge. And here's another point I want to make. We see all this natural evil around us, and it seems to me that suffering is mainly not so much an intellectual problem as it is an emotional problem. If I lose my arm, it's not so much how did this happen, but rather how do I go on? If I lose a child, my biggest dilemma is what is the meaning of life? How can I keep living? It's ironic that for all the intellectual difficulties that one has in explaining suffering, when someone really suffers, a child has cancer, for example, or a mother loses a daughter, atheism has nothing to say to such a person, except things happen. On the other hand, the Christian, the theist, can address suffering, make suffering perhaps meaningful, offer the suffering person hope. In that sense, it seems to me that theism and Christianity is offering something that people can really benefit from, some consolation, some expectation about the future. Meanwhile, the atheist, in a sense, has got to say nothing but, this is the way things are. Live with it.
Your question, I think.
Earlier, you, in talking about the universe, you offered some rather vague speculations. I mean, there's been 100 years of scientific progress that has coalesced around the idea of the Big Bang, the universe, if you will, having had that primordial moment, not just, by the way, the beginning of matter, but also, if you will, space and time coming into existence. Now, here's what I want to say, and that is, isn't it the case that you said you've talked to a guy who's done some work on this, and you said it is possible to imagine. Christians are often accused of what you could call the God of the gaps. When you can't explain something, God did it. Aren't you resorting to what could be called the atheism of the gaps, in which if you can't explain something, you basically say, we'll explain later, science is figuring it out, go with the atheist assumption for now. In other words, to get rid of the simple explanation, God, you're basically waiting for atheism to kick in sometime in the future, aren't you?
I don't understand why it would be a simpler explanation to say that the world was created by a divine being who has existed forever than it would be to say that the universe has existed forever. It seems to me that to say the universe has existed forever is a simpler explanation. Now, your argument was that the universe actually hasn't existed forever, that science says there was a Big Bang, and this in some way supports the creationist account of the universe. All I'm saying is that science doesn't say that. Science only says the observable universe began 13-point-something billion years ago, and with a kind of a bang, and has been expanding since. That's all it says, and that's all it can say. So I'm simply saying there is no argument here to believe that your hypothesis, that it was created by a divine being, is in any better shape than the hypothesis that it has always existed.
Well, you just said that the observable universe is the universe we know. Are you saying that science can discern what occurs in unobservable universes?
Obviously not.
Exactly. So, in other words, what I'm saying is, in order to avoid the implication of God, in order to abolish one unobservable God, you're inventing one or multiple unobservable universes, aren't you?
I'm not inventing it. I'm saying that it's a possibility that existed, just as it's a possibility that the God that you believe has existed. I'm simply saying there's no extra points for you on this side.
Well, your turn.